Welcome to MLI. Bienvenue à tout le monde. Willkommen, because we are honored to have the German ambassador with us today. I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I would like to welcome you all to our special panel event entitled Reimagining Canada's Energy Future, Partnerships and Collaboration with Indigenous Peoples. I really appreciate you all being here. Many faces are familiar to me, but there are new faces in the room, and we're always glad to add people to the list of those who attend our events. As I believe many of you are aware, for a number of years now, MLI has been the nation's leader in inspiring a positive, forward-looking national discussion of the place of Indigenous peoples in Canada's resource economy and in Canadian society more generally. This is only part of our work at MLI, which is intended to make poor quality public policy unacceptable in Ottawa. This is a big job we've taken on, okay? Our work in Indigenous Canada and the natural resource economy has received a great deal of recognition, including being shortlisted for the Templeton Prize a couple of years ago for the best think tank project in the world. On a different topic, some of you may have noticed that our recent paper on the forgotten people and communities where opportunity is disappearing rather than expanding in Canada was a front page story in last Saturday's Globe and Mail. And my recent op-ed in the Toronto Star on why we should not allow Huawei to participate in the development of our 5G network got the highest number of votes ever received by a Star op-ed on their online poll. But I don't want to distract you. Back to today's topic. Canadians, I think, would benefit from understanding the profound transformations underway in the energy sector and the emergence of Indigenous peoples, governments, and businesses as major players in the oil and gas economy. While important issues remain unresolved, major equity investments in supply chain infrastructure and the ongoing Indigenous engagement in policy and business development are potentially tremendously positive. The future of a major sector of the natural resource economy rests on the quality and the nature of Indigenous engagement. And we're delighted to be able to bring together today precisely the kind of people Canadians should be hearing from, to look past the headlines about conflict and protest, to examine what has gone right, and to speak frankly about what still needs to be done for more Indigenous peoples to prosper from the careful development of the resource riches on and near their traditional lands. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce Brian Schmidt, who's the president and CEO of Tamarack Valley Energy. And Brian is going to tell us a bit about his firm's close work with First Nations, which have helped to earn him the title of Honorary Chief of the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta. Brian, would you come to the podium, please?
Good morning, and thanks for having me here today. I want to talk to you today about how the oil and gas industry has been making strides in developing mutual beneficial relationships for decades here in Western Canada. From where I sit, it's been a real success story, and frankly a model for how industry and Indigenous peoples can engage and work together. But I know that's not always a story that you get to hear. So I'm grateful to be here today to share with you the things that I'm seeing and hearing on the ground. I need the little channel changer here. I've been told that I have a little bit more time because one of the speakers isn't here today, so I'll probably just add a little bit of a personal story to some of these things that I'm talking about today. I've worked with oil and gas producing First Nations for decades as a partner, an investor, and a trainer, now as a board advisor to Indian Oil and Gas Canada. I've also been appointed as an advisor to Indian Resource Council of Canada, the National Coalition of Chiefs. Both are with organizations are advocates of economic development. However, one of my proudest moments was becoming honorary chief of the Kainai Blood Tribe, and by my friend and business partner, Chief Roy Fox. Chief Fox and First Nations leaders, men and women like him, are working to create economic opportunities for people. They're driven to end poverty on their reserves and the hopelessness it creates. I also chair the Indigenous Policy Group for CAP, a Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, so I have a good sense of what companies are doing, what their challenges are, and where progress is being made. So today I hope to give you a first-hand, and I think more accurate, sense of relations between Indigenous communities and the oil and gas industry than you'll find in the news. Allow me a moment to put into context the significant opportunity that exists for Indigenous peoples and all Canadians in the oil and gas sector. Now, this slide is a very interesting slide that correlates between population growth and oil consumption. And you can see there's a pretty good correlation. The only deviation you see from the correlation is the last few years. And so you're seeing the per capita increase on oil consumption happen. And the reason that's happening is the rate at which we're taking people out of poverty. So, and there still is about 1 billion people in the world that live in energy poverty. And as you're well aware, children breathing in fumes from fuels that are biofuels like animal dung and coal, those are killing about 1 million people, 1 million kids per year in the world. So when you lift people out of poverty, they start to consume energy. And that's why we're not seeing the deviation off the population off of oil that you might have expected. I've got a slide that talks about the future growth here as well. I often get told it must be tough to be in a business where your product is being phased out. This chart shows an amazing correlation between population growth and oil consumption. It's not a bad business as the world is consuming more oil than ever. It's growing at a faster rate than ever in our history, now over 100 million barrels per day. The disconnect in the last few years is the poverty equation. And if you look here, this is the chart showing the different forms of energy we expect in the future. So unless there's a disruption, the use of hydrocarbons is here for a long time, and we'll probably continue growing our oil demand here until certainly after 2040. Now the good news is that Canada has the world's third largest oil reserves. There's plenty of opportunity here in Canada if we get ourselves organized to participate in that. But what about the environmental and social issues concerned with oil and gas? In industry, we talk about ESG rankings. So if you've and that's becoming highlighted in the investment community. ESG means environmental, social, and governance. Companies will be ranked, and unless you meet a certain ranking, investors won't be able to invest in your company. But what if we looked at it by country? How would we rank out? Now, some of you may have heard about the Worley Parsons report that ranked countries, but I saw this chart here just recently. It's put out by the Social Progress Network, and it ranks countries by the social cost of producing hydrocarbons. So how does Canada rank out in the world in terms of our social responsibility, environmental responsibility, and our governance? Well, we rank out number 1. So you have to ask yourself the question, why is Canada getting so much pressure on our hydrocarbon industry when we're obviously, according to a number of different surveys, doing the best job of it?
Is it because you're number 1?
Maybe. And I don't, it's a good point. When you're number 1, it doesn't mean to say you take your foot off the gas either. There's still things that we can do and ways we can improve. Simply put, if I'm in the wrong oil business, and the oil business is going out of business, and you care about the environment, I firmly believe that the last barrel produced in the world should be from Canada, not the other way around. Our experience in industry is that the overwhelming majority of First Nations want to work with us in order to create economic opportunities for the communities, and they've gained a lot of experience with industry. They are empowered through their constitutional and inherent rights to make sure deals are done in ways that provide the most benefits possible to their people with the least environmental harm. That usually looks like employment and subcontracting opportunities, but more and more we're starting to see negotiations for ownership stakes. And of course, communities want to see that these projects are completed to the highest environmental standards and safety standards, But in Canada, that's a given, whether you're in Indigenous territory, whether you're on Crown land, agricultural land, or otherwise. There's certainly, these are goals that companies share. Oil and gas and resource development in general hires twice as many Indigenous workers, and they're about 88% of our workforce. And we pay them about twice as much as they get on average in other sectors. And I think we consult more actively with communities and invest more in projects and ideas than they care most about, than anyone else as well. There's more to be done, but in reality, there's a cultural shift in the industry in the past decade for how we see our relationship and our responsibilities with these communities. So that's how I'm seeing the oil and gas industry's engagement with Indigenous peoples evolving. But as you know, industry is facing real challenges right now getting projects approved and done. And nowhere is it harder to conduct business and make deals than on Indigenous territories. And if the idea is to address poverty, provide employment, and create opportunities for Indigenous peoples through industry, then we have an uphill battle. Let me show you some examples of that. This is a chart from Indian Oil and Gas Canada, the federal agency which regulates oil production on First Nations land. It charges more royalty for oil produced on reserve land than the Crown does. Sounds like a good deal for First Nations, but in times of a downturn, like now, capital leaves First Nations first in order to deploy it to areas with lower royalty payments. According to IOGC itself, First Nations leases are down 95% in 4 years. Simply stated, no one is exploring on First Nations land right now. Secondly, when prices are low, like they are because of lack of pipeline capacity, First Nations must give back some of their royalty to the producer just to prevent the well from being shut in due to it being uneconomic. This is a standard arrangement with any mineral landholder, but it means First Nations suffers more than the producer when oil prices are low. Royalties and fees in Western Canada have dropped from $250 million down to $50 million since 2012. Now, I know that number is abstract, so let me break it down to you in a number that shows the impact to actual people. That drop means that for First Nations that rely on royalties as a source of revenue, their average loss is equal to over $18,000 per household, family of 6. In the midst of poverty, that's a heck of a burden that they're facing because Canada can't build adequate pipeline access. Thirdly, with our uncompetitive business environment, investors and companies are simply moving their capital from Canada to better jurisdictions, and we've seen investment fall from about $40 billion a year from the energy industry. International companies have sold over $55 billion in Canadian assets to be deployed elsewhere. Big oil can move its capital, but First Nations cannot move their territories. They're left behind with an inactive, uncompetitive market and stranded assets. This chart shows a lack of interest by large companies and investors' flight out of Canada, and you can see the equity raises just drying up. Equity raises really what drives the capital projects in Calgary, in Canada. You can also see the stock chart that shows that Canadian industry investors are pulling out of Canada relative to the United States. And fourth, most First Nations-owned businesses are entering the oil and gas industry have done through subcontracting and procurement opportunities. They rely on new construction and they rely on growth. But right now, with our poor investment climate, there's no new growth. Projects are going into caretaking mode, and many of the big multinationals will continue to make money or move money. But it's the small businesses, the trucking, the catering, and the construction trades that really feel the pinch, and that's where the jobs are being lost. And we need to turn this around. If we want to improve the lives of Indigenous people, we need our oil and gas sector to be successful and competitive. I want to finish today by asking you to check some of the assumptions you have had about our industry and about Indigenous economic development in general. First is the idea that Indigenous communities and people are against resource development, and the oil and gas in particular. In fact, I think the opposite is the case. I work with the board of the Indian Resource Council. They have over 130 First Nations as members. They are not from Alberta or Western Canada, but from all over Canada, and they represent elected chiefs and councillors. and their goal is to ensure First Nations are not disadvantaged by federal legislation as they work to develop their own economies through oil and gas development. They exist to promote involvement of industry. Today we were to have Delbert Wapas join us, who couldn't attend today, but he's leading a team of First Nations that have a real solid proposal to buy Trans Mountain, one of the largest projects in Canada under construction. And then there's the idea that First Nations and Métis people aren't or don't want to be involved with oil and gas business. And I think about my relationship with Chief Fox, because we are friends, but we are also business partners. And he's a tough negotiator. He definitely doesn't let our friendship get in the way of getting the best dollar out of me. But I remember he once told me he wasn't working with the industry, he was part of the industry. He considers himself to be an oil man. He's been in the business for 40 years, and the Kainai tribe as a whole has been in the oil business for over 70 years. So I think we have to ask ourselves, why do we have a hard time thinking about Indigenous peoples as being equal partners in industry? But it's an easy time thinking them as victims of our industry, opponents of our industry, and what does that say about our stereotypes of Indigenous people in this country? And finally, I want you to think about reconciliation, about how we approach it in Canada. The government has put a lot of focus on education, governance, and social programs, but there actually is one TRC call to action out of the 94, it's number 92, that calls for us to provide access to jobs, training, education opportunities, and Indigenous peoples get from long-term benefits from economic development projects, and that's economic reconciliation. From the Indigenous leaders I get a chance to work with, it's one of their highest priorities to create jobs for their members and get contracts for the businesses and generate some revenues so they can make their own decisions about their community spending on recreation, housing, and social programs and things like that. I recall Blaine Faval, a Cree leader who happens to be in the oil and gas, saying a few months ago that reconciliation means Indigenous peoples are not the poorest people in these lands. And it's my belief that poverty can only be addressed when Indigenous communities are fully engaged in the resource development sectors. For many communities, that means oil and gas, because the truth is, there aren't a lot of other opportunities in rural and remote Indigenous communities that can sustain a functioning economy. More jobs and revenues may not be sufficient to address the legacy of colonialism, but they're a necessary part of the equation. I truly believe that the best possible outcome from our country and for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is to have a well-functioning, responsible, world-class oil and gas resource sector with interested Indigenous communities as full partners. And those of us who use in the oil and gas industry are willing to work to get there. And First Nations are doing their part too. But now we need the federal and provincial government to step up and play their part in supporting that outcome. Thank you for your interest, and I look forward to entertaining some questions about these issues. Just a final note. I put this up. It's one of the things I didn't have time to mention here is industry's involvement with cultural preservation on First Nations. And this particular scene is out of a movie, full feature film movie that we put out with the Kainai tribe, and it's about a small boy who becomes connected to the elders in his community. And I wouldn't have thought film would be such an impact for us as a company to work with the Kainai. But it really was one of the best things that I've ever embarked on. It put the employees of my company in touch with the First Nation in a way that I can't really describe here. But you take my assistant down there, and she pretty much knows everybody. The guy and I tribe there making this movie. It really brought the community and the organization together. So this is our third part of a feature film that we did. We do one a year, and they're all about cultural preservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I was delighted amongst many of the things that you said in your talk. I was delighted that There was, first of all, a picture of Stephen Buffalo, the head of the Indian Resource Council, who is a senior fellow here at the Institute, done some terrific work for us. And you also mentioned Blaine Favell, who is a member of our board of directors and part of a large number of very senior Aboriginal leaders that I think Ken will talk maybe a little more about, involved in the work of the Institute. And we're very proud of the terrific network of Aboriginal leaders who have wanted to be involved with the work we're doing. So having mentioned Ken, let me now introduce him. My friend, my very dear friend and colleague, Ken Coates, I think is known to many of you for his tireless work in the cause of self-determination and prosperity for Indigenous peoples. Ken holds the position of Canada Research Chair in Governance and Innovation at the Johnson-Shoyama School of Public Policy in Saskatchewan. That's not very important. What's important is he's a Monk Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he has spearheaded our project entitled Aboriginal Canada and the Natural Resource Economy since its inception 6 years ago. In fact, the project got underway one day because I felt this was something that the Institute should be working on, and I started reaching out through my network to find out who were the best people in the country to work on this. And I kept hearing the name Ken Coates. And I finally connected with Ken, who was in Japan at the time. And I think it was something like midnight or something in Tokyo. And we spent about an hour on Skype talking about the project of which this meeting is one of the important culminations. And I'm very proud of the things that Ken has led for us at the Institute. He's won many honors and accolades along the way through this project, including from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. He won their award for excellence in Aboriginal relations a couple of years ago because of his leadership of this project. And I'm now going to hand the program over to Ken. He's going to make, I think, some scene-setting remarks and then moderate what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. Let me invite Ken up to the podium.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. As Brian mentioned, our Aboriginal people and Aboriginal Canadians and Natural Resource Economy project has been going on for a long time. It's a project that was actually started by First Nations coming to us and asking as Macdonald-Laurier Institute to sort of take a leadership role in raising the issues or policy issues around Indigenous reconciliation, economic reconciliation and involvement. The part that Brian didn't mention, I'm from the Yukon. Very important sort of for me, defines who I am and how I came to sort of understand issues. And I grew up in an environment where Aboriginal people had been, quite frankly, systematically left out of the resource economy for over 100 years. Sort of marginalized very, very effectively over that period of time. I should also mention really quickly that Delbert Wapas was supposed to be here. He is the director of Project Reconciliation, the leader of that and the founder of it. Delbert had a family medical emergency last night, about an hour before he was getting on the plane. And so he greatly regrets the fact that he's not able to be here. He was hoping to be here, and I hope he'll keep his family in your thoughts and prayers. This is a tough day for Delbert and his family. And if he were here, Delbert would actually agree with what Brian said already. And he would also agree that, quite frankly, you ain't seen nothing yet. And he would point out that, in fact, through Project Reconciliation, which you may know about, this is a strategy that First Nations have come up with on prairies with the goal, essentially, of purchasing 51% of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I bring that up in this context to say, none of you sort of are probably overly shocked by that now. You've heard about it before. We've talked about it a little bit. That's actually a really new development in Canada. 5 years ago, if you had actually said, First Nations are going to take a major equity position and perhaps buy half of a major pipeline project, they would have said, you are crazy. They would not have believed that this kind of scale and interest was possible. But I want to take advantage of, at my age, I'm desperately trying to find good things about being older. And I'm running out, the list is getting really short. But one of the advantages, the real advantages, is you have a chance to sort of look back over the last 50, 60 years and sort of see how things have changed. And so as part of the scene setting, I'll do this very, very quickly. Remember where we were 50 years ago. We've got a bunch of young people in this audience who were 30 years away from being born 50 years ago. And the transformation is stunning. In 1970, Aboriginal people in this country had almost no legal recognition of their rights to natural resources. They had almost no legal recognition of their rights to hunt and fish, and certainly not to fish for commercial purposes. This is the 20th anniversary of the Marshall Decision, but only 20 anniversaries of the Marshall Decision, which brought commercial fishing back to the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy people of the Maritimes, and transformed that economy in ways that we're still just starting to sort of try to figure out. But also realize that in 1970, there were no comprehensive land claim treaties under negotiation in this country. In fact, a former Prime Minister Trudeau, basically among many other things that he said he's not going to waste his time on historical might have beens. We are not going back and signing new treaties. So the treaty thing was off the table. The idea that Aboriginal people had special rights, off the table. The idea there would be such a thing as Aboriginal self-government, off the table. The idea that the government of Canada would solve the problems of Indigenous people through social welfare, on the table. That was the strategy. The strategy was building homes and providing welfare and telling Indigenous people what to do through a bureaucratic structure that was actually stunning in its size and scale and impact. So I go back to growing up in the Yukon. Aboriginal people had almost no significant role in the sort of formal economy. They're very active in the informal economy, in hunting, fishing, trapping. They were willing to work hard, but discrimination was strong, marginalization really intense. And, you know, my friends from high school, I went to high school in Whitehorse, when they graduated, my non-Aboriginal friends moved into the economy right away. They got jobs. Most of them are smarter than I is. They went to work right after they got high school, and they all retired now. They look at me and say, why are you still working? They did really well. Non-Aboriginal people, or Aboriginal people, not so much. The opportunities were simply not there in the number and variety that we actually expected. So what's happening in the oil and gas sector, just to put some context to the rest of our discussion, I won't take very long with this. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was almost no Indigenous presence in the oil and gas industry. You mentioned your community, you were talking with the Blood Tribe involved, but that was a fairly passive process. They discovered oil on Indigenous lands, and in fact, government signed up leases on behalf of First Nations that they started exploiting those resources, and now they're having legal battles about paying back, compensating them properly for those sorts of activity. Brian's giving you an indication of what's going on now. This is hard to believe because it's just been part of our story. Is the oil and gas sector, somewhat surprisingly, is sort of the front lines of reconciliation in Canada. It's the one place where it's working. Try to go into downtown Ottawa, downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, and see where Indigenous people are engaging very strongly in the local and regional economies. Tabitha is going to tell us more later on about how this is actually happening. You just don't see it because it's sort of 1,000 pieces of light that haven't yet become a spotlight. But we're going to sort of get there in time. But look what's going on now. There are dozens and dozens of Aboriginal communities who are developing oil and gas resources on their own lands. They are now heavily involved in equity investments. This is the #1 area of Indigenous business growth in Canada, is actually in the natural resource sector. The mining sector, by the way, is doing sort of roughly as well as the oil and gas sector. So these are really positive and exciting and important developments going on. So what's happened? Aboriginal people went to court and basically said Canada is not following its own laws. And the courts have agreed many, many times. There's been about 250 significant court cases involving Aboriginal people demanding the right to have some influence over resource development. They've won more than 230 of them, right? It's one of the interesting things Jody Wilson-Raybould was trying to propose when she was Minister of Justice. She says, let's stop fighting. We lose all the time, right? And we spend millions of dollars fighting Aboriginal people, and they get to the courts, and the courts say, yeah, the Aboriginal folks are right. So one of her main points when she's Minister of Justice was, let's figure out a new way. Let's stop fighting through the courts as much as we were doing. We're seeing the development of modern treaties, including in oil-bearing areas in the Mackenzie Valley. We've seen the rapid development of Indigenous self-government, the like of which we've never seen before. We are seeing the rise of Aboriginal economic development corporations. The other sort of part of what Brian was talking about here is that the communities own their own businesses. Sometimes it's individuals who own the business. Very often it's communities that own the businesses. And sometimes the development corporation will have 10 or 12 or 15 individual companies. They'll have a contracting company over here. They'll have an oil drilling company over there. They'll have a whole apparatus going on in this area. There's also in Aboriginal communities growing frustration with their economic realities. Indigenous communities are by far and away the poorest in Canada. Poorest parts of the country are northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, northern Ontario. The wealthiest Indigenous parts of the country are places with oil and gas industry, where they're actually seeing some substantial returns. In Fort McKay First Nation, the average family income in Fort McKay First Nation is over $125,000 a year per family. That's not a model you see most other places, including in the non-Aboriginal community. So that's really impressive. We are seeing this phenomenal transformation that I think we underestimate. We got communities now who many years ago, basically 10 years ago, 20 years, not that long ago, used to say, our job is managing poverty. The government sets up an administration, they give us some self-government and delegated authority, they give us some money to manage affairs, but basically they leave us in charge of our poverty. So you need 100 houses, we're going to give you 5. You decide who gets them. You got 150 people who want to go to post-secondary education, we're going to give you 25 grants. You decide who gets to go to post-secondary education. That's a difficult challenge. Managing poverty is an incredibly difficult process. We're now in an interesting situation where you've got Indigenous communities that are managing prosperity, which is equally difficult, by the way. What do you do with the money? Do you take the profits and divide them equally among all people? Do you reinvest? Do you invest in culture, et cetera, et cetera? So nowadays, I just find this absolutely fascinating. This is the old guy talking again. I find it absolutely fascinating that it's commonplace to hear of $100 million projects, to hear of $500 million projects. Brian really quickly mentioned that Suncor is involved with Aboriginal communities. There's an $850 million purchase of a Suncor tanker farm that involved 2 First Nations communities, Fort McKay First Nation and Amisikyu First Nation. $850 million. It was subscribed 3 times over when it went to the financial markets to actually raise the money. The private sector said, yeah, we can invest in these kinds of things. You've got 2 projects in the greater Vancouver area that are worth more than $2 billion, owned by First Nations people. These are really exciting, dynamic things, and it changes the conversation in a very, very substantial way. So we're seeing changes. We're seeing Aboriginal people involved in revenue sharing. Most parts of the country now either have revenue sharing or are building toward it. So in the Mackenzie Valley, about 25% of all the revenue that comes from natural resources goes back to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. That's a really interesting and important development. The Yukon has it built into their modern treaties. British Columbia has it on a project-by-project basis. And only a few provinces, Saskatchewan leading the way, does not want to have that conversation. So we're seeing real change. Coastal GasLink, which is the natural gas pipeline that goes to Kitimat in British Columbia. There's basically 20 of 21 First Nations along the line who've supported it. And in fact, the official people support it. There's an issue around traditional governance in that area, and so they're not fully endorsed. However, the Haisla, who are sitting at the end of what will be one of the largest private sector investments in Canadian history, are enthusiastic boosters of the liquefied natural gas industry and essentially say, this will give us a future. Notice what I said, not this will give us a better future, this will give us a future. More than half Aboriginal people no longer live in their reserves. Most of half of them have moved away into southern cities. The people want to keep the reserve strong. You can't have a strong reserve without a strong local economy. So what we're going to talk about in the conversation we're going to have next is basically about how the ground rules have changed and what the possibilities are, because they're much more dramatic than people think. I was talking to Tabitha about this just before and sort of saying, you know, we're actually in a process now where First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are buying back Canada. And what a wonderful and positive development that is. They're taking the revenues that they have through their legal rights, through their investments, through their business activities, and they're buying up the infrastructure. The city of Saskatoon has a number of urban reserves. It has people who are buying hotels, people who are buying parking lots, people who are starting up new businesses and running gas stations and doing dozens and dozens of things of that nature. They are deeply embedded in their communities and their regions, and they're investing very, very well. We've changed the model of consultation. If you go back 20, 30 years, consultation was sort of a, by the way, we're building a pipeline next door. We don't do that anymore. We have deep and profound consultations. And First Nations have their right, as they're doing in British Columbia, to go to the courts and say, you haven't consulted enough. And if the courts say you haven't consulted enough or haven't consulted properly, they go back and force them to do it again. We're seeing equity development emerge in a major sort of way. We're actually seeing Indigenous governments have substantial, what we call own source revenues, which means they have the money separate from the government that they can spend on their own sort of own affairs. And we're seeing a level of community engagement in the resource economy that quite frankly would have seemed impossible only 20 or 30 years ago. Not perfect at all. A lot of challenges and issues. Brian will tell us, Tabitha will know this as well, that there are communities that are uncomfortable with some aspects of development, as there are non-Aboriginal communities that are uncomfortable with some aspects of development. I spent a lot of time in my life in Vancouver. You know, and you sort of, oh, Aboriginal people are opposed to resource development. It's like going to Vancouver and saying non-Aboriginal people oppose resource development. Well, some do. They all live in Vancouver. Shouldn't say that. Go backwards on that part and take that out, okay? Anyway, there's a lot of legitimate opposition and questions about any kind of development of any time. We're talking about a parking lot or talking about a shopping center. These things actually happen in many parts of the world. So we'll stop with this point. Indigenous people are an active, large, and little known part of the current natural resource economy in Canada. Much more so than we really generally appreciate. They are absolutely key to Canada's energy future. We will not have an oil and gas industry that does not have active and constructive and positive community-based relationships with resource companies, with governments, and with regulatory processes and environmental evaluations and assessments. I think the point we're at right now, and we're going to talk about this among the three of us, is that the country's finally catching up with where Indigenous people are. Indigenous people made these decisions, as Brian pointed out, 20, 30 years ago. They got tired of poverty. They got tired of intense poverty. You know, poverty is, sometimes it's a statistical, sort of manifestation. It means you're earning less than the rest of the public. We're talking about grinding poverty in many Aboriginal communities. That is simply not acceptable to them. It shouldn't be acceptable to other Canadians. Ironically, it isn't more government investment that's the solution to that process. It's actually engagement in the broader economy, and that has worked out extremely, extremely well. So this event today is part of that larger process, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on working with Indigenous organizations. Brian mentioned that we have people like Stephen Buffalo, Charlene Gale, who's the president, the chair of the First Nations Major Project Coalition. We work with LNG, First Nations LNG Canada. We work with Indian Oil and Gas Canada. We work with a number of Indigenous communities and development corporations, basically working with them in a common goal of creating the public policy framework we need to actually make things work better for First Nations all across Canada, for Métis and for Inuit people as well. So with those introductory remarks, I'd like to introduce the third member of our panel. And again, Delbert does send his great deep regrets for not being here. But Tabitha is not a replacement for Delbert, right? She was here already. So, but she too was, I'm sure, hoping that he would be here with us. We had a really interesting 5-second discussion where we discovered Waterloo connections. So I was the Dean of Arts at the University of Waterloo for 6 years, 5 years. Brian, the saddest day of his life, I think he described it, was when he left his wife behind and dropped his eldest son at the University of Waterloo because she could not take the separation. It sounds like Brian is still shaken very much by that process of leaving teenage boys in the hand of university academics, not such a good idea, but I hope he survived and did well. And Tabitha is actually an engineering grad from the University of Waterloo, electrical engineering. And you'll know that Waterloo has one of the best engineering programs in the world, and its co-op program is absolutely first rate. Tabitha has a very good and interesting experience with IESO, the energy regulator in Ontario. She is the Chief Operating Officer for the Acadian Council on Aboriginal Business. She's a member of the Nipissing First Nation. She's a very talented Indigenous leader. If you don't know about CCAB, that's kind of too bad for you. CCAB is a brilliant organization, the Acadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Their role basically is to promote Indigenous engagement in the economy, in business development, but also to encourage non-Indigenous businesses to figure out how to work more effectively with Aboriginal communities, with Aboriginal employees in that regard. And it has had a major impact on the country as a whole. So just to let you know sort of the rest of the process, Tabitha is going to join us up here. Brian's going to come back. The cat came back and Brian came back too. And we're going to have about a 45-minute conversation. And at the end of that time, we'll leave at least half an hour, about half an hour, for conversations. One of the things Brian Lee Crowley does with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is he orders us to follow the time. So we will not be here at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Our event ends at noon. We promised an event from 10 o'clock till noon. Brian was a bit slow getting things going, but we'll work on him. But we will end at 12 o'clock. And we'll just sort of get your questions ready for sort of that period of time. I'm going to ask a series of questions to our panelists and contribute a little bit myself, and then we'll proceed with questions after that time. Okay? So, Tabitha, welcome.
Thank you.
It's really great to have you here.
Thank
Really great to have you here. And Tabitha told me her story on CCAB, so this is a really great job strategy. So Tabitha's job strategy was that she actually got on the board of CCAB. What did you say? You went to one meeting?
One meeting.
One meeting, and then sort of was now taking over the organization.
Yeah.
Which wow, that's a really good career building sort of process. So if you get invited to go on a board, that may be the rest of your career. So, Tabitha, just to ask the first question to you, if you don't mind, and then Brian, please follow up afterwards. Why are Indigenous people getting involved? It's not Indigenous individuals, it's companies, it's communities. And this is a big change, as I was saying just a little while ago, from not so many years past. What's going on? Why are Indigenous people embracing the natural resource sector in the oil and gas industry?
I think a lot of it is what Brian touched on as well, is a lot of that resources in and near the communities that they live in. And I don't know if, just to tell you an interesting story, there's a company called Boucher Construction, which is operated by Nicole Boucher and her husband. They live up near Fort McMurray and started a business that basically they had one unit of equipment and $25,000 of debt after the first year. And she just recently won our Indigenous Women in Leadership Award, and someone asked her that question, a difficult question about, as an Indigenous person, how are you able to manage supporting the oil and gas industry? And her answer really sums up that question. She said, that's where I live, that's where my family members and community members live, and that work is happening. And in order to make sure that we were working on employing Indigenous people and supporting our communities and supporting our economy, we needed to get involved. And I think the other part is, Indigenous people have been told, as you said, for quite a long time, what the future and their future was going to look like. And if we want to be part of determining our own future, and self-determination needs to have economy to go with it. So if we know that development is going to happen, and that development is often happening near our communities, we need to get involved, and we need to ensure that we're benefiting from it. But we also need to make sure that it's being done in a right way. From an environmental perspective, the elder talked about 7 generations, and that's something that we think about in everything that we do. What's the impact on my 7th generation on what we're doing? It's a very different business model than what happens on Bay Street for sure in Toronto. So I think we need to also marry those two, marry business, the speed at which business happens, and the speed at which communities and Indigenous people make decisions as well. And I think the oil and gas industry has, as you said, been doing this for quite a long time, but we are seeing a number of other industries come along as well lately. So our membership at CCAB is growing significantly in many different sectors, which is exciting.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Brian, you mentioned really quickly in passing, so I'm trapping you on your own words, pretending I'm a gotcha journalist or something like that. One of the things you said was for the resource for oil and gas companies, one of the greatest challenges is working with Indigenous communities. That in fact it's hard, that it's not an automatic kind of thing. Tabitha just very quickly clearly said, there's an Indigenous agenda, there's an Indigenous way of doing business, there's an Indigenous, long-term perspective. It doesn't jive with quarterly returns and shareholders' equity.
Yeah.
So talk about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think if you went back the 30 years ago you're talking about, when we didn't have to really consult, we didn't know that was a requirement. If we wanted, as long as we weren't right on First Nations land, we could do our projects, go through the regular governmental process, and get on with it. And that's not the way it is anymore. And let's face it, we're a bunch of engineers and accountants, and all of a sudden now the duty to consult comes. And not only that, you have communities that are put together so that there's also you start to build a relationship with First Nations, and you see poverty firsthand. So it wasn't just the force on duty to consult, it was our communities are next to theirs, and we don't like what we're seeing as a human being. Now that's something you probably haven't heard before about care and about the importance of living next to somebody who's struggling. Now I remember I used to be president of Apache Canada. We were flying people up to Zama. They'd live somewhere else, fly up there. And here's a community right next to where my operations are, in poverty. Well, there was a business case to have employment there for me. I didn't have to fly people up, put them in camps. They're right there. So this wasn't forced upon us. It was actually really smart business. And then as employment happened, like Tabitha said, then contracts happened and businesses started to develop, and we would help those businesses along. So it was the right thing to do for a long time. Now it's the only way to do business. You said that the oil industry cannot exist going forward without First Nations. That's a very important relationship. So we have developed that and honed that and tried to perfect it as much as we can. Still work to do for sure. So when we see policy being developed, the policy is written as if First Nations need protection from industry. And that confounds us because we're not, sometimes we look at it and we think that First Nations need protection from policy. And so you brought up about how do you get smart policy, and you get smart policy by understanding the way things are and how do you drive change. And as we've all admitted here, there's been a huge change in the relationship.
Great. Thank you. Tabitha, just to pick up on something that Brian was just saying, we talked a little bit about businesses having to adapt to Indigenous expectations, and give me a bit of a sense, if you could, on what those kind of adaptations are like. I'll just reflect a little bit that when Syncrude, was involved in the north, they had some difficult relationships with Fort Chipewyan. That's changed a lot. Fort Chipewyan is now a member of Project Reconciliation. And they kept thinking, well, why would these folks not participate? Why would they not join our company? And why are they not working here? So they did this really radical thing. This is now 35 years ago. They went up to the community and said, why aren't you participating? What's going on? It was a really strange thing to do, right? And what they discovered was that, in fact, Indigenous people have a whole series of obligations. Hunting, fishing, feeding the elders, ceremony. If somebody dies, in an Aboriginal community, when somebody dies, the dynamic changes really quickly, where all of a sudden, the community shuts down for 2 or 3 days if it's an honored elder. So they talked about it for a while, and Syncrude actually developed one of the first in the country, not the first, but one of the first, where they basically said, we need you to give us 50 of your employees, I don't know what the number was, 20 or 50 of your employees, every Monday. We're going to bring them down to our camp for a week, and then we'll bring them back home. But we're going to train up twice as many people. So what we want to know is that you've got your 20 there, we've got 40 who are trained, and you decide who's ready to come. If one person has to go hunting, they can go hunting. And they can work the following week, right? So give us a bit of a sense of the kinds of adaptations, if you could, of the companies are being asked to make and are making in this regard.
Yeah, I think so. My background is in electricity, and I managed the First Nation Métis Relations Group at IESO for 4 years. And at that time, we were doing consultation, but we were also through this regional planning process where we were looking at how do we need to plan the electricity system for the next 10 years. And a number of people at the executive team at ISO and in policymakers were more saying, well, we're not going to go talk to communities until we have the plan. We're not going to go speak to them until we know what needs to be built. But that's way, way too late to go and talk to a community. First, you need to be out there talking to communities and building relationships when you don't even know if you're going to be doing anything in that area at all. They need to understand who you are. I mean, particularly the electricity sector in Ontario, there's 35,000 acronyms. So every time somebody goes there, they have a different acronym. And communities are, being met by so many people all the time that the demands on their attention and the demands on their being able to review what you're giving them, being able to make decisions on what you're talking about is extraordinary. So I think one thing is really making sure that you're building that relationship way before you even start to think about building a project or working on a project. That's something that needs to be planned into your business very early. The other thing is being very, very adaptable. So the one of the first consultation sessions that we were going to do up in Thunder Bay, we're all there, we're ready to fly out, and 2 children had passed away in a boating accident in one of the communities. And the chief emailed and said, we won't be there, and I won't be able to meet with you for a week. Like, I need to be here with my community. So I think that's something else that businesses need to understand is, you may have one chief in that community who is responsible for every portfolio. So he's responsible for education and health and any community work or any consultation. So the asks on his time are much more dire than they are in others, and you're not going to be the top of that priority. I think that's a very big thing. And even if they have a consultation worker, that consultation worker is going to have probably 50 files on their desk every week. So I think that's another big key takeaway that I learned in that process and that businesses are learning now. At CCAB, we have a program called Progressive Aboriginal Relations, and it's a program that businesses, non-Indigenous, and we do have some Indigenous that are going through it as well, walks you through 4 pillars to look at what are you doing for Indigenous employment, what are you doing in community relations, what are you doing on leadership actions, and what are you doing from a procurement point of view. And it's really hard. I mean, the oil and gas industry has been doing this for a long time, but other industries have not. And it's always hard to ask the tough questions. There's lots of corporations who want to do good work, but they don't know where to start. So it walks you through that process. It allows you to look at what am my corporation currently doing and what can we do in these different spaces, and then set some targets to do that, and then start to implement those actions. And a lot of the oil and gas companies have gone through that process. Their procurement, as you mentioned about Suncor, Suncor set a target to procure 5% of their spend from Indigenous businesses, and they're reaching over top of that now annually. And they've done a lot of work for community relations as well. So they have been awarded a gold standard in this certification process for PAR. But it is a tool that it includes also cultural awareness. And we have jurors that go out and interview the Indigenous employees in the organizations, but also interview the communities that those organizations are working with. So it is it's not, no one's going to say that it's easy to start that work with communities, particularly when you haven't worked with them before. But that's a process that we've established, and there has been a significant amount of interest in it, which I think is positive.
Yeah, very positive. I always like to sort of surprise people with things, but you and I talked about this a bit before, so it's not a surprise to you. Procurement's an interesting issue, and it's a policy issue. Where does the government buy its stuff from? And CCAB has a bunch of really interesting publications, and we work in partnership with them on a variety of things, but they just released a report recently about procurement. And CCAB has been advocating for the federal government to spend 5% of its procurement allocation with Indigenous businesses, which is kind of difficult when First Nations don't build very many ships. The big ticket items are kind of off the table. But of course, the big issue that I've heard in Ottawa when people are saying, well, you can't do that. Aboriginal people couldn't possibly meet 5% of the demand. So CCAB did a really detailed econometric study and showed what?
So of the over 50,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada today that we have in our database, we looked at the federal spend from 2017 and actually looked at all of the industry classification codes specifically. And the Indigenous businesses in Canada today can meet 24.2% of the federal spend from 2017. And there were some categories
Not quite at the 5% yet.
Not quite, yeah, but we are currently never have they spent over 1%.
Yeah. But are capable, just to reinforce the point.
Capable of 24.2. And there are some categories that were unclassified, so that number could be as high as 30%.
Yeah. It's time to change our perceptions, I think, in a whole bunch of different ways.
Well, and you have corporations that are doing, way more than that, right? So it's time for the government to meet that.
I think one of the figures there they had on the chart was 3.3 billion with Suncor alone in 2015-16. That's huge.
And that percolates very much through the local economy. And
Yeah.
interestingly, one of the things I find fascinating is it doesn't just percolate inside the Indigenous community. When Indigenous companies are involved, they tend to spend the money within their region.
Absolutely.
It actually magnifies the economic impact of resource development when Indigenous folks are directly involved. So both of you, start with you, Brian. If Delbert was here, he would have given you a wonderful talk about project reconciliation. And he would have said a couple of things, is First Nations can do this, we can buy 51% of the pipeline. Secondly, he'd say we can't operate this because we've actually got a lot of business people doing a lot of business things, so don't come up with stereotypic ideas that we're not going to run a business successfully. There are very successful business things. Third, that in fact, project reconciliation was based on a model borrowed from Norway, where basically they want to create a sovereign wealth fund that then is used in perpetuity to support Indigenous communities with their own immediate needs and things of that sort. But since I'm not Delbert, I can talk about more other things as well. Calvin Helene has a proposal to build a pipeline that would actually go through northern British Columbia and actually go to the Alaska Panhandle. There's a proposal to build a railway to take bitumen actually from northern Alberta to Alaska. And actually take it out through Valdez, Alaska, which is a major oil shipping point from the Alaska pipeline. There's other proposals underway for Indigenous folks to sort of build pipelines, buy pipelines, maintain pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. What's going on? What's going on? This is, again, even 3 years ago, none of this would have been on the table. Calvin Helene was. He's been talking about this for a while.
Well, I think a couple things are going on. Because there's a need for First Nations and industry to work together on a number of fronts. You're starting to see the pipeline, things like pipeline and tank farms as one of the projects in Fort McMurray did. Now, why these things are happening is because, I think from industry's perspective, we need capital. I just showed you that the capital spend, we used to raise through public markets about $30 billion a year. And now that's gone to like pretty much zero, really. So there's a pretty good need for industry to attract capital. And if it comes through First Nations to invest in projects, perfect. And typical projects, the ideal project is one where there's what we call a cost of service fee, a pay fee for a certain service, and pipelines fall into that category. So First Nations can take an ownership in a pipeline. They can go to a bank. It's tied to a contract with a large multinational, or in the case of the pipeline, everybody agrees to take or pay contracts to take we're going to send you this crude, and if you don't, you can sue us for the next 20 years. So the banks love that paper. They can go, that's like a blue chip. And we in industry don't really want to put our capital in those kinds of projects. I need a higher rate of return because I'm taking risk. My shareholders are different shareholders that will take that risk. Whereas if I can pay someone a fee to take a lower risk pipeline ownership or tank farm ownership, and that's good business for me. And it opens the door for First Nations. So they can go get some private equity help to get them kickstarted. They can leverage it up because it's tied to a contract, and they can take that steady fee income. Works beautifully. From the industry's point of view as well, we're very well aware that most First Nations are, you won't hear this in the papers again, are supportive of these kinds of projects. Let me just grab, most of these, let me take Gateway. The First Nations had, I think there was 35 First Nations that were going to participate in equity ownership in that pipeline. And that's, so what you do hear in the papers is the few that are opposed. And that's the conflict that the newspapers will report. So we think that by bringing First Nations in as partners, there is an acceptance and there is more recognition that First Nations are for development. And the interesting thing we saw recently is if you were a chief that was pro-development, you were often chastised for speaking out that way. And what we saw here in the last 2 to 3 years was pro-development chiefs becoming more vocal, taking a stand in the newspaper and letting their thoughts be known. That didn't used to happen. So I think there's just a natural fit here for both. And I think I think that is going to be the way to do business. As Tabitha said, you don't go with a project. That's the old way of doing things and say, here, it's licensed. You got any problem? You want to tweak it? No, that's not going to happen anymore. I think you're going to have projects start right from the ground up. You're going to say, we'd like to build a pipeline. We'd like you to be partners. We haven't even started. Are you interested in working with us? And bring them in from ground zero. And the successful companies, that's the way they're conducting their business right now.
Great. Right, Tabitha, your thought. What is actually going on that we're seeing so many of these projects of such scale and such magnitude, such potential impact on Canada?
Yeah, I think part of it is you're not going to do development unless you have an Indigenous partner. And from an Indigenous perspective, we've had a high focus on, and there's been a high focus across the country on the legal relationship and the social impacts. But we are, as you said, managing poverty. The gap in the UN Human Index between Canadians who are ranked 6th to 8th and First Nation people are ranked 63rd. And that gap has hardly changed in many, many years. So I think it's time that we need to manage wealth as Indigenous people. And the way to do that is to get into the economy, to lower our employment rates and be able to have wealth that we can manage within our own community. And the interesting thing in Suncor, and who now currently the CEO, but at the time was the CEO, Mark Little, said, when he works with a First Nation or when he supports a First Nation business, that money's not going back to a golf course membership, was his example, but it's going back into the community, and that community is then building a nursing home or upgrading their water treatment plant, or so he, even from a care perspective, sees that money transferring into a community and building the community better. Yeah. I think the other interesting thing that maybe we're not seeing as much now, but we're definitely having a lot of conversations about, is investment in ESG ranking or in your CSR ranking. There's a lot of ESG rankings that don't currently look at Indigenous relations as part of the ranking criteria. I was interested in that ranking to ask if that was part of that, but there's a lot of investors who are coming to us saying, how do we know what corporations are good for us to invest in? And if we want to ensure that our money's being invested in reconciliation or what we're doing with our dollars, specifically right now churches, but there's a lot of people looking at a mutual fund that's about reconciliation, and what corporations would we know are doing good work with Indigenous communities. So I think that's part of it from an investment point of view as well, is something that corporations are really looking at. What's the benefit for us to ensuring that we're having good relations?
Neat. Time to just follow up quickly with you on a sort of somewhat related question. You mentioned, Brian mentioned, I mentioned own source revenue. I just want you to give us a bit of an indication of why that's an important issue. And so own source revenue are sort of profits made out of businesses, revenue that comes from royalty sharing arrangements and things of that sort. Why are Indigenous communities so focused on own source revenue?
Well, I think the funding that was established from the federal government hasn't changed in years, and communities need to be able to, first, the funding that's there for education may need to go to the water treatment plant in a certain community, or there are a lot of myths that every First Nation person has their education paid for, and that's not the case. There's a certain amount of money that goes to the community, and that amount of money can support a small number of individuals to go to school. So communities need to be able to make that determination of what they want to do with their money as well. So it's not tied back to reporting back to funding sources. But also, in my community, as an example, and this is something a little bit different on a relationship basis as well, just to go back to that, we had a land claim settlement that came through to our community. And what we did with that land claim settlement went through community engagement. So it wasn't just money that went to the community and then the community and our chief and council decided what to do with it. They went to on reserve and off reserve. We've put that money away in a trust, and the decision is what are we going to do with the revenues from that trust? And that was a decision that was voted on by the entire community. So very different than what would happen in a business or even a municipality, right? Yep. That's going to be a decision made by your mayor and councillors, not by the entire community. So I think it's really about us being able to be self-determination about what we want to do and how we want to grow.
Yeah. Brian?
I can pick that up. But
Thank you.
I think Chief Fox was actually invited to come here and couldn't make it either. So early on, we were going to travel together. But I'll tell you what he would tell you today, because I do, as a chieftain, I gave my commitment as an obligation to care about his people. So long after I'm through the oil and gas industry, that is a lifetime commitment to do what I can to bridge the gap from modern society and his people, and what can I do to close that. So I can tell you what he's looking for. As Tabitha said, if you cannot rely on source revenue from the federal government to keep your subsistence. You have to look for other revenue sources to come in. And the Kainai tribe has been very successful at bringing in, they have an export hay business. They've signed a long-term contract with Sumitomo, Japan, to export hay. They've been doing that for 20 years. Big business. He's about to embark on a electric 300 megawatt plant that he's getting approval from the provincial government to construct that. He's bringing in his own equity from private equity sources to go and build that. He's hired the expertise to get that project in place. That's going to happen. I've taken a lease on 67 sections of land. I've made capital commitments to on his property. Every well costs $7 million to drill. I'll drill my first one in the first quarter, and we'll put a number of his people to work. So he's looking at revenues to come from all of these other businesses to supplement what is going on and take his people out of poverty. Not only that, he wants to make sure that they have careers. He wants to give them meaningful careers and meaningful lives and contribute, not collect a check from somebody. He wants to build capacity, and he's doing that. And we employ a number of his people. You saw a picture of them with the drill rigs. But our ongoing operations, we employ a number of his people as well, and we're doing our bit to train. I've taken them to other locations as well, and had them employed as well. So I know what goes on in his mind, and I do believe that the strong relationship is when I care as much about his people, and he cares about my business, and we care about each other. That's when things really align. And I know a lot of oil companies will go and send their First Nations relations person into the community. That just doesn't work. It is, a lot of times these things are, as we say, chief to chief, and that's where to start. That's where that first engagement really, for these major projects, that's where that has to happen.
So let me pick up on your comment about capacity building and sort of ask Tabitha a question about this. It's sort of a bit of a twist. And just as a side note, there's almost 30,000 Indigenous Canadians in colleges and universities today. And you know, if you go back to 1970, remember, keep going back and thinking about these old time things, there were about less than 500 in 1970, Indigenous people in colleges and universities, now over 30,000. And Tabitha mentioned this as well. If they had resources, we're talking about poor people whose family can't support them, if they had resources, that number would go up by 10 to 15,000 next year. If the money was there for the kids to go to university and go to college, it would skyrocket really quickly. But I want to talk about a different kind of capacity development to put this guy on the spot. It's very common to sort of talk about capacity. Everybody nods their head and says, yeah, Aboriginal people aren't very skilled. They haven't got the education, haven't got the training. There's another kind of capacity, and that's the capacity to work with Indigenous communities, to actually have cultural knowledge, cultural awareness. You talked about PAR as an example of this. Is there a capacity deficit in the private sector in terms of their ability to work with Aboriginal communities in a productive way?
Oh, for sure.
Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, and it's not, I wouldn't fault anybody for that. Yep. I think it's not been a requirement. Our education system, it hasn't been built around building that capacity or understanding. I mean, it's getting there, or was getting there now, but people were not taught the proper history as children. Many of us were not. So I really don't fault anyone for that. And I also think it's difficult to have those conversations. It's difficult to ask the questions. People are afraid of asking the wrong question or offending someone, so that's a human nature. But I think there definitely is a deficit. We are seeing a significant growth. So just at CCAB, our membership is growing about 30% a year. So we have 860 members currently. And 45% of those are non-Indigenous businesses. So we are seeing a significant interest in understanding and asking for help along the way in order to build their relationships. And as I said earlier, we're really seeing that in a lot of new sectors, not just I don't want to say this badly, but not just organizations who need to work with Indigenous communities for resource extraction. So we're seeing IT communities coming on board, and sports communities. So the Hamilton Ticats just became a member, and NBA Canada became a member, and they want to go through the PAR program so that they can understand what more they can do. And I think part of that is TRC 92, for sure. A lot of that probably can go to Gord Downey and the Downey Wenjack. It really did wake a lot of people up that maybe weren't as well informed before. So I think there is a gap, but I'm positive to think that it's closing.
Excellent. Right?
Well, it's, I learned something here. When you look at the, when I hear people who aren't as well informed on these kinds of relationships, for example, sometimes I'll get, well, can't they just decide what they want and then we'll get this pipeline done? Like, why are they always opposing things? And they get put into the same camp, the same box, as if, what is there, 630 First Nations across Canada, something like that? They, 630. Do you think they're going to have a different opinion? They're all independent organizations. They don't act as a group. They don't behave as a group. They don't want to be a group. We keep putting them as a group. The same is for industry. There's a lot of diversity on how First Nations relations happen within our industry. But I will tell you this, the ones who get it are going to do well. The ones who get this right are going to be successful. The ones that don't get it right probably aren't going to last, because that will be the new norm in Canada. That will be the way to do business.
Interesting. And just a really small side note is that the Daniels decision of a couple of years ago is changing the role of Métis people in the sector. And the Métis rights are going to become far more crystallized. We're going to have Métis treaties and self-government arrangements, which will add to the complexity in many ways, but also the authority of that group of Indigenous people. And it's fascinating, if those of you have paid much attention to the Arctic, that the Inuit and Nunavut in particular, and Nunavut in the Western Arctic, are incredibly interested and engaged in appropriate resource development. Right? They're not opposed to it. They are willing to work with communities and being quite successful. So making sure we avoid political commentary. So we're in the middle of an election, but Macdonald-Laurier Institute works very hard to stay out of the election fray in terms of partisanship, so I'll ask you to both do the same thing. So this is to all parties. You got a chance to talk to the leaders just before they go on the debate floor in next week. What do you tell them are the one or two policy things that they really need to do to encourage Indigenous engagement in the oil and gas industry and resource development generally? Become policy wonks for a minute.
I think we're nonpartisan as well at CCAB, but we are really pushing on Indigenous procurement and procurement from Indigenous businesses, both from the federal government and from all provincial governments as well. But for federal government to make a commitment to ensure that they're procuring from those Indigenous businesses, and even the need to get in, even just the requirements to get into the federal government's procurement is quite difficult for some smaller businesses, but there's nothing stopping the federal government from procuring and requiring large shipbuilders to ensure that they have a 5% requirement from Indigenous business. So if there isn't an Indigenous shipbuilder out there, you can make that requirement put on your Indigenous business. And we see some corporate partners doing that already. Suncor, for example, and Bruce Power here in Ontario, they're requiring that all of their suppliers are using Indigenous businesses as well. And I think from that perspective, you're building capacity, you're building business across the country that can put on their resume that they had a federal contract, and that's just going to help them to encourage and to grow as well. So I think that would be one of the major things. The other policy thing I would speak to is infrastructure and broadband. So a lot of our Indigenous businesses, one of the limitations is the location that they're in. Wanting to make sure that they stay connected to their community, but they don't necessarily have the infrastructure in that community in order to be able to grow their business and scale their business up. So that would be the two things that I would.
Great. I think it's really fascinating that we're still talking about water in fewer communities now. The numbers dropped quite dramatically over the last few years. But we're still talking about water supplies. And we haven't even really started the conversation about the internet capabilities into these remote communities. It's really staggering, isn't it? Your policy ideas, policy areas where you want the government of Canada in particular to move.
Yeah, I'm in this election thing, I need to be a bit careful as well, but let me put it this way. October, Chief Fox phones me up, said, Brian, I want to take you out for lunch. I said, what's going on? Oh, I'm just happy because you said you bought this oil field on my reservation. You said you were going to drill and get the royalties up, and you did. My check went from $200,000 a month to $650,000 a month, and I want to thank you for that. Now, it's 2 months before he gets he's 2 months information out of date. And if you remember October and December, oil in Canada tanked, like seriously tanked. So I met him for lunch, and I said, Chief Fox, I'm going to buy lunch today. What? Well, no, I said, listen, your royalty checks next month, even though your production has doubled, is going to 100,000. How could that be? How could that be? And I said, well, pipelines, differentials, that's the way it is. And I explained to you in my speech about how that affects First Nations and harm, and it's very damaging. So can you imagine he comes to celebrate, and now he's got to deal with that kind of loss in revenue in his nation. People in poverty. Think about that a minute. So you wonder why Chief Fox was so vocal on pro-development. There's a huge driver, and he just needed to have the information to deal with on why this is happening. So my message on policymakers would be, look at how policy affects First Nations, and I think we always look at, as I mentioned earlier, that policy is written to protect First Nations from industry. It's never written. I mean, a number of policies have come out by the Ministry of Environment, not the Ministry of Industry. And if you look at approval processes, it goes through the Ministry of Environment. Very little is given to the economic benefits that of giving First Nations, how it takes them out of poverty. So that's why you're seeing a lot of First Nations agree to these projects. By a long shot, the majority. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we have to have 100%? Are you always going to have 100% agreement of all the nations along that? How do you make those kinds of decisions that 100%? There's nothing. There's no election process. There's no democratic process at all that requires 100%. And I think that's something we really have to wrestle with. And that's not an easy thing to think about. So, and you know, I think a number of First Nations don't think you have to have 100%. Because can you imagine being in project reconciliation and then having your investment tied up and all the revenue? So I think that's something that I think we should engage First Nations in discussions about how do we do these things in such a way that we get our cake and eat it too. We're just not having that kind of conversation.
So maybe one more question before we go to the floor. So just to put you on notice that question time is coming shortly. We often talk in these kind of discussions about what government has to do. And then we're getting better at talking about what corporations have to do. So we come back to you and what are you doing on capacity building and PAR sort of relationships and everything else. What do First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities have to do? What are the blocks and barriers at the Indigenous level that need to be addressed, if there are any? Tabitha?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think so much of it is what is needed in communities in order for us to be able to do what we would want to do or are ready to do. Yeah, I think it is true, and I think a lot of it also is, the media does grab on to the opposers more than they do the people who are supporting projects and celebrating the good projects and partnerships that are out there. So I think there could be more discussion around the good work that's being done and showing those good partnerships that are out there. We do see some of them, but we definitely, and maybe that's part of human nature, that we grab on to the opposition stories more than we do the positive ones. Yeah, I think like First Nation and Métis and Inuit businesses and economic development corporations are really ready to be part of the economy of Canada, and Canada needs to catch up.
Just as a small aside, there's between 250 and 300 development corporations. It's not a concept that the country as a whole is all as familiar with as they should be. And some of these enterprises have $2 billion or more in assets. These are not small, corner grocery stores. Some are. Some of them are very local, sort of a couple of retail operations in town. Some of them are very, very large. I have a friend who runs a development corporation in Yukon. They currently have 37 profit lines. 37 revenue streams that they have. They own airlines, they own hotels, they own all this kind of stuff. Community of 400 people, by the way. So this is not a very large community, but they have 37 revenue streams. And they actually just started what they think is going to be the first or the second First Nations venture capital fund in Canada. So they want to sort of use their profitability to invest in other First Nations to support the work that they're doing. So part of the answer that they're seeing is, it is our responsibility too. What can we as a First Nation do to make this better? Great answer, Tabitha. So as a corporate executive dealing with First Nations on a regular basis, what do First Nations have to do?
Well, the key thing is your governance, because if you're going to attract capital to get these projects started, then the governance structure of the First Nations really needs to be addressed. So when you have an election every 2 to 3 years, and industry doesn't know what's going in, and capital doesn't know what kind of governance structure they're going to have, they're going to be very hesitant to put capital in. The successful First Nations that I've seen deal with this create a separate governance structure from the political system internal in their First Nations. And that's worked out real well and gives business the consistency it's looking for and predictability it's looking for. So if you can manage to get, you get that much capital if you don't fix that, you get that much capital if you do. And it'll make a huge step change. I think the other thing is working with industry to get business acumen. We can do some exchanges on First Nations. Bring them into our organization. Then they might go back and they're dealing with another oil company, but they're doing it from a position of knowledge, and that works out very well. And I know I've mentored and trained Oil and Gas 101 to First Nations across Canada, and tried to bring their capacity up so they can sit with oil companies on the other side. And that's worked out really well. So acceptance of capacity and governance would be the two.
Wonderful. I only have 400 more questions, so I won't ask any more right now, but I will turn it open to the floor. So I would only ask that, I wish somebody would put their hand up so we, so just keep your sentences or your questions relatively short, so we can go from there. You were first? No, behind you.
Thank you. For one who actually was aware that some of these things were happening, I find what you told us today is absolutely remarkable. And you've mentioned about people seem to be only aware of what they read in the press. The question is, how aware is the bureaucracy and our political parties of what's been achieved to date?
Great question. Okay.
I would say not as aware. As CCAB, we are nonpartisan, but we do go in and meet with a number of different ministries, specifically on trying to promote procurement. And there isn't an awareness, first, that there's this many businesses out there that could meet the demand, though that report was supported by the federal government, a ministry in the federal government, so they are asking the questions, but they're definitely not aware of the capacity of the Indigenous businesses to meet their demand currently. And I think there are still some biases in all political parties on the risk of doing business with Indigenous businesses and that it's going to cost more. And we need to also dispel those biases in the work that we're doing. With the campaign happening, we are working to try to ensure that all parties are aware of the work that CCAB is doing, the work that the other national organizations are doing, and that there are great stories out there of corporate partnerships. So when we go and meet, we'd like to bring one of our members with us who has done great work and can really speak to their own experience with Indigenous business. But there's a long way to go on building that awareness.
Great, thanks. Brian, you want to answer that?
Well, the chart I showed you was from a federal agency, Indian Oil and Gas Canada. So they're certainly aware of the revenue shortage that First Nations are seeing due to those losses. I would say beyond that, there's not a very good recognition of the number of businesses and the success stories here. In fact, I was asked by one bureaucrat not to really show that chart with the employment figures when you compare. And that's why I come back to who needs protection from who here. We're doing a great job with that. We can do better, but 8% is good. 3.3 billion in services in 1 year is a good number.
Great. We have a question here.
I want to thank Brian especially for revealing to us that Canada is actually the most responsible country in the world in terms of development of oil and gas. This is not known worldwide. But I'll go even further. I think our oil, gas, and industry is not only going to save the climate, but it's going to save the world from extinction. And I'll tell you why. For those people who think that renewable energy is the way to save the climate, they are totally wrong. There was a private study done at the National Research Council some 30 years ago, internal study, which showed that the best thing to deal with these so-called clean renewable energy sources is to burn them, because they consume more energy to make than actually they produce over their lifetime of operation. And the way it's calculated now is on the basis of renminbi and dollars. They are manufactured in countries where the economy is a low-cost economy and operated in a country where there is a high return. And even so, this is the case, it takes about 8 to 10, maybe 15 years before they can pay for the cost. But if you do the audit on the basis of energy, you will find that they will never actually produce the same energy as they have taken while they were being manufactured. Now, the indigenous people can play a role in that, especially those who are presently opposing the oil and gas industry, because importing oil from troubled countries is causing a lot of problems. We have to stop that. We have to produce energy for the West from our resources. And I wondered what you think about that, and how can you persuade them to change their mind?
Tabitha? She's saying, please don't ask me.
So it's maybe just a choice of words, but I would never try to persuade a First Nation person to change their mind, or Inuit or Métis. I think we need to do more around education. So education on the stats that you just said. But I think we also need to respect that Indigenous beliefs really look at the climate and the fear about what may happen. It's more about a risk-based fear. So similar from work that I have done before on talking about nuclear and nuclear build. There's a real fear around nuclear waste and what do we do with the nuclear waste. And they're thinking, my 7th great-great-great-great-great-grandchild, what happens if something happens then to that? What happens if it leaks 7 generations from now? So that's really what you're working with, and that's a lot of the times where the opposition comes from.
Yep. Okay, Brian, quickly.
So I have some more tours and speeches to give, and I cut that part out of here because I just didn't have time. 7 out of 10, recent poll, 7 out of 10 Canadians think action needs to be taken on climate change. 6 out of 10 Canadians think we should have a healthy oil and gas industry. How do you reconcile that? And how do you frame that? And the way I look at it, most, if not all, CEOs think climate change action has to be taken, even though you produce hydrocarbons. So to get to your point on what's the most efficient, I'm not sure, but I do know this: we are cutting our carbon footprint massively. Huge change in the oil sands, so that oil is almost the same as any other oil around the world in terms of carbon, and we're on our way to improve that. Most recently, Suncor announced removing their cokers and putting in cogen. Huge change on carbon. So if we can produce this stuff at a lower carbon footprint, that's where a lot of the focus is being taken right now. And when you see the social index there of Canada, you can get your head around, well, if there's going to be demand in oil in Canada, we should be the last barrel because we're doing it in the most socially acceptable way in terms of ESG. So there's, I think no question there, but the fact of the matter is, as I showed you, it's going to be a long time before we get off it, for the reasons you brought up.
Quick question here? Yeah. Trying to get to everybody. Brian's next, and then the person in the back.
Brian had mentioned that once a pipeline is owned and you have contracts, there's access to conventional funding. But Tabitha, for your members, for smaller members, the trucking company you mentioned, is there access to financing that any community in poverty is unlikely to have? Do you have unconventional? Do you have community development funding? Do you have Grameen Bank type funding? Is there something the Canadian Treasury is doing to support this? I know the U.S. Treasury has many different kinds of community development credit unions that might be a model for you.
So there are things called Aboriginal financial institutions that were started out of the BDC. So they do get funding, and that funding goes towards helping new businesses. It's a fairly high interest rate, though. There are some other newer investment models, so economic development corporations, Indigenous economic development corporations that are then reinvesting back into other business models. And they're, one of the largest issues is access to capital. And part of that is if you are on First Nation land and you are starting a business on First Nation land, you don't own that land. So a bank won't give you a mortgage because you have no collateral. So there are some banks that are starting to work around that equity position and have found ways in order to provide equity and capital investment to First Nations. So we are moving there. But right now, really through the AFIs that are there, private investment, and communities reinvesting back into businesses.
Just a small thing, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has a report up we just did on Aboriginal financing. And it shows that Aboriginal folks have actually drawn more than twice as much equity financing over the last, was it Brian, 10 or 15 years than they were before. But they have very little access to regular private sector equity things. So they're having to get government guarantees and things of that sort, not because they want to, but because there sort of are no other opportunities. And so it is something very much worth working on. Brian?
Just on that, certainty of contract is the big deal. You got to shrink that down to scale. So we have a role as industry, part of reconciliation, to provide an emerging business, First Nations business, with the certainty he needs to go to the bank. So if something happens, in times, I know of some companies, including my own, where we'll backstop that contract financially.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
thanks, Ken. So if you think about the nature of the natural resource economy, it involves, generally speaking, huge investment upfront, which is then paid back over a long payback period, 25, 30 years. Let's take an example. Is it LNG Canada? Just made a final investment decision, build a liquefied natural gas plant. How much? $41 billion.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much got to be spent all up front, right? And then there's a payback period of 25 or 30 years in which they're subject to a whole series of uncertainties about, what will be the price of the commodity that they're putting through the pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is one of the reasons why the natural resource economy in particular is so vulnerable to any kind of uncertainty, because there's already uncertainties they can never control, like the price of commodities over 25 or 30 years. But you've got to convince people to part with the money right now, the whole money, in order to get the project going. You can't say, well, we'll produce a barrel first, or a cubic meter of gas or whatever, and see how it goes. No, it's the whole thing, right? And this is one of the reasons why I think the natural resource economy has suffered some real problems in recent years, because the certainty that we were able to give through our institutions, National Energy Board, for example, about what were the tests that you had to meet in order to get permission to build a pipeline or whatever. That certainty seems to be a lot less clear than it once was. And the question that I wanted to ask to this panel is, one of the new things we've layered on top of everything else, we already had quite a lot of regulatory requirements for people to get permission to build pipelines, or open oil fields, or liquefied natural gas plants. On top of that, we've now layered this requirement to get full consultation with Aboriginal people to seek to accommodate their interests and so on. I'm completely in agreement with this. The question is, how do we integrate that requirement into this institutional edifice in a way that creates the certainty that unlocks the investment? That's where I think we aren't there yet, because we keep having to make it up as we go along in every single relationship with every single First Nation, and nobody knows going into any negotiation what is going to be required this time. I know maybe what was required last time in different circumstances with a different community, but there is, it seems to me, very little certainty, and it goes partly to something that Brian talked about, the governance structure, for example, in First Nations. Ellis Ross, an Indigenous leader in British Columbia, has talked about, for example, the problems that are caused when an Aboriginal community endorses a project, the council endorses it, everybody's ready to go, and then there's a council election. The next council says, sorry, not doing that. And that kind of uncertainty is absolutely death for the natural resource economy for exactly the reasons that I've just mentioned. So interested in how we can get that certainty in this new layer of regulatory requirement.
So create certainty in 30 seconds.
Yeah, you're just not going to get it.
Great question.
It's just not there. And so there won't be, I don't believe.
Is there any way to move more in that
direction? I think so, yeah, but it's going to take a lot of work between three main groups, government and industry, and most importantly, First Nations territory. We got to sit down and talk about this, how we do this. But we're not in a, you just won't see the big projects. They won't be proposed, those kinds of projects anymore.
Interesting. Tabitha?
Yeah, I think I would agree. Unless you're dealing with the same community, again, that has a governance structure, you may have some certainty, but as Brian said earlier, every community is unique, and you're not going to be able to build one model that fits all communities and all of their unique needs and cultures and hunting and fishing and how their way of life, really their traditional way of life, I think would be very difficult. But I think building the relationship very early, so if you're going into a project, you already have a relationship. If the community is a partner already before you go into the investment, that's going to get you a lot further along the way on certainty. Yep. And I do agree on the governance structure as well. That's something that we ran into a lot in the electricity industry, also because of the time it takes to make a decision. So if you're needing quickly to have something signed and you need to get a band council resolution, you need to call a band council meeting, that takes a lot more time. But if you have a governance structure that has the ability to make those decisions and sign off on those contracts, it helps definitely to move the business along faster.
Can I just ask you something, quick supplement? So it seems to me that we make our lives more difficult by doing this strictly on a project-by-project basis. Nobody ever says to government, business, and the Aboriginal communities in Canada, can we sit down and imagine a system, an institutional structure here, so that people know what the rules are? That doesn't mean that you're committing yourself in advance to any particular
So one of the things, Brian, this is, and I'd be interested in your comments on this as well, but if you look in Canada, sort of the best Indigenous policy in this country is starting in the north and working south. So if you want to see where we have that kind of process, you have certainty in the Yukon, you have a modern land claim settlement. Same with Nunavut, same with most of the Northwest Territories. And so Nunavut's proceeding with some very substantial projects. Now, they were stopped in even the considering oil and gas exploration by the government of Canada's decision to sort of basically ban oil and gas exploration in the Arctic alongside with the United States. But that was a federal decision without any consultation with people of Nunavut, and they were really upset about it. But you have that. You have it in the modern treaties. You know the rules. And that doesn't mean you're going to get agreement, right? But the Yukon actually has way more mines going now than it had 10 years ago. And partly, people have figured out how to work within the rules. Yeah, great question. Question in the far back.
Yes, I just have a comment to make. My name's Ann Castle. What I would observing from this, and just wanted to pick up a couple of points, is that there are many, that most of the development has taken place on a project-by-project basis, and in the oil and gas industry, with exactly the kind of experience that Brian has had of getting to know the community, building relationships over a long period of time. And then within that, you can almost sort of see a trajectory of, local procurement contracting out for services, building roads, food services, jobs and things that are relatively low skill but build expertise, and then moving on from there. And there's sort of a hierarchy of that. And if this organization or Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers linked up with the major logging associations and the mining associations of Canada, and there are provincial and federal levels, you could basically work out almost stages of development. And people can sort of, various Aboriginal groups can then sort of plug themselves into that. Well, we're a small band, we're kind of isolated, but we've got 30 women who can cook and provide food, for instance. To another group, which is far more sophisticated, has a well-educated chief, a council that is behind him, and he can set up a separate economic development organization with some competent, really excellent driving force, and basically mobilize the resources around. What's so scary about the whole tackling the issue, and I think this is what Brian's getting at, Brian for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, is that it's also fragmented. Most of the models that work between business and First Nations are there. It's a matter of sort of right-sizing and persuading people. There are many communities that are slow and resistant and want to move ahead, but they also want to protect their interests. And I think that one of the weaknesses of the current government is it doesn't seem to have been able to pull together the regulators. The Department of Indian Affairs faces a disappointing performance of its economic development in terms of just project-by-project funding. Energy, Mines and Resources has been far more successful with exploitation of forests and through its grant programs. There's a lot of patterns of development there. And I think I'd like to see this group organizations and the organizations at the head table get together and start to pull something together.
Great, thank you very much. Comments on that?
I think the idea is good. I think we need to look at it a little differently, that we're not plugging the communities in, but the communities are going to be developing something together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really...
I'm not saying plug in, but, sorry, I really want to emphasize it's very important that communities develop themselves, and we haven't been talking enough about that community development and their own aspirations and wanting to engage or not engage.
Yeah. Thank you. Brian, any quick comments?
Just something I'll mention, because I think I've covered most of these points, but there's a new organization called the National Coalition of Chiefs, and its purpose is to draw out pro-development First Nations and give them some of the things that you're looking for, some support in how to get involved in projects for those that don't have the experience. And I think that's going to be really important. The idea of that is to be a multi-resource extraction type association across Canada, forestry, mining, oil and gas. And I think that really has, I'm putting a lot of hope that that actually can influence policy and can work really well.
Great question and great comments. I mean, I would just simply add that I think one of the challenges is that First Nations have very, very few resources. They don't have a lot of money. And so when you talk about these processes, you've got government with enormous resources on one side, industry, which used to have a lot more resources than they have now, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities that don't have. And so just getting to that process is really, really hard. Question?
If you could indulge me, I'd like to read just a paragraph, a short paragraph from Gary Mason's column in the Globe and Mail on Saturday, which was dealing with the question of foreign environmental groups undermining the Canadian oil industry. The Premier misses another important point. It is not just Greenpeace or Sierra Club that believes these should be no more pipelines. Many everyday Canadians believe it too. Their concern with climate change is reflected in poll after poll. When Liberal leader Justin Trudeau campaigned in the 2015 election against the Northern Gateway pipeline, he wasn't just caving into the demands of environmental groups, he was responding to the demands of Canadians generally, not to mention First Nations groups, many of whom wanted nothing to do with the project. This, I think, is the narrative, the Canadian narrative, from media decision makers, where the Indigenous role and the positive Indigenous role in economic development is simply ignored. What you've said today is enlightening. I think those of us who come to Macdonald-Laurier Institute briefings and read their papers are aware of this. But what can you do as a group, as a concerned group, to try to change or at least achieve some balance in what the media and certain politicians are putting out, which I think is a biased or a non-factual interpretation of the many Native groups and Canadians who support these projects.
Great. Thank you very much. Tabitha?
Yeah, I think the same to what this gentleman asked about being able to ensure that we're sharing the stories of good partnerships and sharing the stories of communities like Mikisew Cree and the James Bay Cree, who Suncor bought 40% interest in Petronor that's owned and operated by James Bay Cree as well. So just making sure that we're getting those stories out into the media as much as we can. But the media is going to grab on to the story that they're going to grab onto. I mean, so that's a bit difficult for us to. They like the opposition story for sure.
Great, thank you.
We weren't very good at this for decades in the industry. And we watched things happen before us, and basically communication got one-sided, and we did a poor job. And did a poor job with First Nations. And I think, I mentioned earlier that chiefs have a hard time because often they're chastised when they're pro-development. And I think that's changing. So I think getting the Canadian voice out is important, whether it be pro or against, making sure that's a Canadian voice. Getting the First Nations voice, that's the one that's really gets drowned out and confused, that message. So I think getting them the resources so that they give their own opinion to the newspapers themselves, regardless of what situation it is, without influence of industry, without influence of foreign environmentalists.
Just two other quick observations. I think it's really interesting how much effort has been gone into just to change a couple of words. For a long time, the answer was First Nations opposed this, Indigenous people opposed that. It was never true. Some did, and some did not. So now most journalists use the language of saying some First Nations oppose, many First Nations oppose. Those are much more accurate numbers than saying unequivocally. And I just want to refer quickly to a comment that Blaine Favel made when he talked at a dinner we had here in Ottawa back in February. And he gave quite a strong statement about what he called ecological colonization. And he said, in the 19th century, it was missionaries and government people coming and telling First Nations what to do. And he said, quite frankly, we're tired of environmentalists coming and telling us what to do. Indigenous people have their own environmental sensitivities. They're extremely strong. They're completely devoted to their territories. They do not want to see them, despoiled or destroyed or whatever else. And we said, we don't need outsiders of any description coming up and telling us how to run our affairs. And they're finding that relationship that's going to be a very tense relationship in the years to come. Because, some environmental groups work very closely with First Nations and share their views very strongly. Others are strongly and almost diametrically opposed. And that tension is getting very strong. We have time for like a 30-second question and quick response, and you've been very patient, sir.
Thank you very much. The first presenter indicated that we had the lowest social cost of all suppliers of oil. At the same time, the only hope we have to get more Canadian oil to Tidewater is the Trans Mountain pipeline. In the meantime, we're also importing foreign oil in parts of Canada from in some cases, unsavory regimes. And we also now have a case presented to the federal court, supposedly going to be handled quickly, but where the media at least reported that no one showed up to present the defense. Supposedly the federal court said they're going to handle this quickly, but it's not certain that Trans Mountain is going to go ahead in the meantime. Does anybody here know what, if anybody's going to present a defense at that, or are they still applying the Jody Roosevelt-Wilson strategy of don't bother to protest because the court will make a proper decision even if no defense is presented?
So the, if I've got my facts right, I think the Alberta government did get, I think there was 12 oppositions through the courts, and 6 were dismissed, and I believe the provincial government has taken responsibility for putting a defense on those to get those out. The rest, I think, I think they're just going to play its course and let the courts let the courts decide. It seems to be usually around who does the consultation, and I think we in industry, it's interesting because I think we've learned how to consult with First Nations for the most part. Yeah, we make some mistakes, but we do a pretty good job of that. And for a while, federal governments through many different governments saw that as industry's role to go consult, not the federal government itself. And now First Nations is pushing back on that. They're saying, just a minute here. I can deal with this oil company. I'll deal with them. But it's you I want to see at the table. We still have a lot of unfinished business that we need to discuss. Good for them. They're using leverage there. And from industry, I kind of don't like it in a way because we can't get our project going. But on the other hand, good for them.
Tabitha, last word?
Yeah, I think to say that the Constitution and the relationship is with the Crown, and it is the duty of the Crown to do the consultation. So I think that's what we're seeing. I don't have an update on the defense there, though.
Well, listen, we didn't get to all the questions. We came pretty close. Thank you for your attention as an audience. Tabitha, that was just marvelous having you here. Wonderful having you here talking from an industry perspective. It was worked out extremely, extremely well. This is not the end of a process. I think this is one of the most important and dynamic policy issues in Canada right now. It has economic implications across the country. If you follow the oil and gas industry at all, you'll know that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Ontario and Quebec who work in the oil and gas sector directly or indirectly. Has huge economic implications everywhere. And eventually we're going to get this right. The good news in all of this, and I think both of you expressed this, Brian and Tabitha, very, very well, is that the fundamentals of Indigenous engagements have changed completely. That this is no longer something you do if you have to, it's no longer something you do when you have to, it's something you have to do from the beginning and from the outset. And the good news is the transformation is very substantial. Barriers to be eliminated, collaborations to sort of continue, new models, Brian's question here about the structures and how you get certainty and whatever else. But I want to, on your behalf, thank our panelists very, very much for a very engaging and very useful and exciting presentation. So I hope you'll pay close attention to the Macdonald-Laurier website. We have events all the time. We circulate reports on a regular basis. Our commentaries and op-eds are working very hard to do what some of you have asked about. How do you change the national discourse and dialogue? I think we do a very, very good job of doing exactly that. And we do it, just to reinforce and make a final point, we do it because we work in full collaboration with Indigenous communities. We have wonderful partnerships with Indigenous organizations like CCAB. We work in a quietly critical way with business in the sense that if we have things to say, we'll say them to you, but quietly and politely. We work with government in exactly the same way. We simply want this to be a better country, and I think we're going to get there. So thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate your attendance here today. Good day.